The agreement was simple. We shook on it 10 months ago, sweating in the stale air of a diner booth, the coffee cold and tasting like ash. Liam and we would take care of the problem. No names, no witnesses, and above all, no trace. The problem was a man named Arthur Vance, a silent partner, a leech who had bled our startup dry, threatening to expose a decade of questionable accounting unless we paid him a ransom that would have left us both destitute. He didn't just want our money, he wanted to destroy us. Liam, being the more passionate one, the one with the hair-trigger temper, had outlined the solution within an hour of getting Vance's final threat. We chose the camping trip for 2 reasons: remoteness and alibi. We picked the High Peaks Wilderness area, a place where cell service was a myth, and the only way out was the 10-mile trail we were hiking in on. We told our wives and employers we needed a weekend to clear our heads after the stress of the company's collapse. The first day was heavy with nervous energy. The weight of the plan felt heavier than our 40-pound packs. Vance was supposed to meet us Friday evening, driving to a specific, unmarked logging road, and then hiking in a short way to a clearing we had designated. He thought he was coming to collect his final payoff. We had a different delivery for him. By 6 p.m., we were at the clearing. It was perfect, ringed by dense pines, with a small stream running nearby to mask any unusual sounds. We didn't even bother setting up the tents. We just waited. Liam was packing, running his hands over the small, rolled-up tarp we had brought. "He's late. What if he got cold feet?" "Vance doesn't get cold feet," I said, checking my watch. "Vance is arrogant. He thinks we're too weak, too scared to do anything but pay." Exactly 20 minutes later, we heard the sound. A low, straining engine, then the distant clack of a car door closing. He was here. We retreated behind a cluster of boulders, hearts pounding a panicked rhythm. We watched him emerge from the tree line. Vance was exactly as we remembered. Slick, overconfident, carrying a small, expensive-looking leather bag. "Liam, remember," I whispered, gripping his arm. "Quick, clean, no mistakes." The plan was a single, swift blow, followed by a burial and a long, deliberate hike back to the car. We would leave no evidence that the 3 of us had ever been in the same place. The moment Vance stepped into the clearing, Liam moved. He was quiet, fast. Vance didn't even have time to register our presence. The plan was for Liam to use the heavy, blunt object we'd brought, but fate, or bad luck, intervened. Vance, startled by a sudden noise from the stream, spun around just as Liam launched forward. Instead of a clean, incapacitating strike, the momentum sent both men tumbling, a chaotic mess of limbs and fabric. They hit the ground hard, right near the edge of the stream bank. Vance let out a single, sharp yelp that was instantly muffled by the earth. I rushed forward, horrified. Liam was straddling Vance, his face twisted in panic. "It's done," Liam said, his voice ragged, his breathing coming in frantic gasps. "What did you do?" He hit his head on the rock. Liam pointed to a jagged boulder jutting from the stream bank. Vance was lifeless, a dark smear spreading quickly onto the mossy rock where his head lay. It was messy. It was not the clean job we had envisioned. "We need to move now," I hissed, pushing the wave of nausea back. "The tarp, the stream, we do this by the book." We worked in a sickening, desperate frenzy, using the tarp to move the body, using the stream to clean up the blood from the rocks. A pointless, desperate act, as the water would simply carry the evidence downstream. We buried him deep, under a pile of loose, rocky soil and heavy fallen timber. We burned our clothes using the few dry twigs we had. By the time the moon was high, the clearing looked almost undisturbed. It was a terrifying testament to how easily a man can disappear. We retreated to set up our tents 50 yards away, ostensibly starting our camping trip. We made a small, safe-looking fire, trying to appear like 2 normal guys enjoying the wilderness. But our hands shook, and the easy banter we were rehearsing for our return felt hollow and false. We were safe, the body was gone, The secret was buried. But as I was arranging my sleeping bag, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Resting on a smooth gray stone at the edge of the fire ring, where Liam had been sitting, was Vance's small leather bag. The bag we were supposed to dispose of immediately. "Liam," I hissed, "the bag, you left his bag." Liam looked at it, his eyes wide and vacant. I forgot, when he fell. I must have kicked it over here." I lunged for it, picking it up. It felt light, too light. I flipped the latch. It wasn't full of money. It was full of electronics. A small, custom-built power supply, a tiny hard drive, and a minuscule, professional-grade camera lens. Vance hadn't come for the money. He had come to record the handover, intending to use the footage for blackmail later. And now one of us, or maybe both of us, had his camera. "We need to find out what he recorded," I urged, rushing to connect the components. Liam grabbed my arm, his grip like a vice. "No, we can't know. We get rid of it, burn it, smash it. Whatever is on there, it's 100 times better for us if we never look at it." But the urge, the terrible, sickening curiosity was overwhelming. We had risked everything. Did this camera hold the proof of our crime? Or did it hold a final, chilling statement from the man we had silenced? I managed to pull my arm free. I hooked the camera to the tiny hard drive and hit the power switch. The small, square drive glowed faintly. There was only one file. I hit play. The footage was shaky. It showed the clearing from a low angle, obscured slightly by a cluster of ferns. It captured the arrival of Vance, the sudden movement, the scuffle. It recorded the loud crack as his head hit the rock. It recorded Liam's panicked expression. And then, as the camera tumbled, it recorded a final, sickening image. My face, leaning over the body, illuminated by the last light of dusk, my expression a horrified mask. But the camera didn't stop there. The last 30 seconds of the file were still recording, despite the body being still. The camera was pointing up at the dense canopy. It was dark, but the mic was sensitive. It recorded our strained voices, our frantic efforts to clean the scene. It recorded us arguing over the bag itself. And then, just before the file ended, there was a sound, a slow, deliberate exhale. Liam and I froze, huddled over the screen. "That wasn't us," Liam whispered, his voice trembling uncontrollably. "No," I replied, feeling a cold dread settle in my bones. "That sound came from the ground near the camera." Was Vance alive when the camera was recording our cleanup? And if he was, did he move the camera and point it at us? We looked at the footage again. The camera had been facing the sky, resting on the ground near the stream bank. But the camera was not on the stream bank now. It was on the fire ring, 50 yards away. Did Vance, in his final moments, move the camera to the fire ring as a last act of vengeance? Or was there someone else? The fear was no longer about discovery. It was about a hidden, terrible variable. We had thought we were alone, but the unblinking eye of the camera and the final sound it recorded suggested a profound, fatal error. We were not the only ones who knew the location of the grave. We stared at the drive, the glow of the screen illuminating our faces, each of us seeing the other's guilt reflected in the tiny, damning image. The woods around us, once a place of safety and anonymity, now felt like a huge, silent chamber with unseen eyes watching and ears listening for our next mistake. The secret was out, and we were trapped with it. I took the job because I needed the money, plain and simple, and because the ad promised absolute isolation. That was the selling point for me, the Deep Creek Fire Watch. 3 weeks alone in a refurbished cabin, high above the tree line in the Cascades, my only job to scan the horizon and report smoke. My name is Mark. I'm 32, and 6 months ago, I was deep in debt and facing a choice between bankruptcy and a questionable opportunity. The questionable opportunity was this job. It paid exorbitantly well for what it was, but the contractor, a shadowy firm called Mountain Logistics, was vague about the details. They didn't care about my resume, only that I could operate a radio and wasn't afraid of being alone. The drive was brutal. It took 2 days of winding, unpaved logging roads just to reach the base of the mountain. From there, I hiked in 5 miles with a week's worth of supplies to the tower cabin, which sat perched on a small, rocky plateau overlooking what felt like the entire world. The cabin itself was sturdy, bolted to the rock, with a 360-degree glass enclosure on top where the actual fire watch equipment was. Below, the living quarters were cramped but clean. A cot, a tiny propane stove, and a shortwave radio, my only lifeline. The first few days were glorious. The silence was a balm to my city-frayed nerves. I cooked, read, and watched the weather systems roll in, feeling like the king of a vast, green kingdom. The only anomaly was the resupply drop. Mountain Logistics had assured me a scheduled helicopter would drop provisions every 7 days. On the 7th morning, I heard the chopper. It was a loud, aggressive sound in the quiet air. I rushed to the landing pad, a small, flat area 50 yards from the cabin, and watched the delivery. A heavy, industrial crate was lowered onto the pad, the pilot never touching down, merely hovering long enough to detach the cargo. I waved, but the helicopter didn't acknowledge me. It just banked sharply and vanished back over the ridges. I went to the crate. It was enormous, made of thick plywood and sealed with heavy-duty metal bands. I found the crowbar inside the toolbox I'd been provided and began working the seals. The contents were unsettling. It wasn't just food and propane. There were standard provisions, sure, but packed alongside them were strange, specific items. A specialized radio scrambler, detailed topographical maps of the valley below the mountain, maps that weren't publicly available, and 4 heavy, industrial-grade metal detectors wrapped carefully in bubble wrap. Why would a fire watch need metal detectors? I sat back on my heels, the scent of fresh pine suddenly replaced by a sharp, metallic smell. The maps were the most disturbing. They detailed a specific, very small area miles below the plateau, a spot marked simply with a red X. This wasn't just a fire watch job. This was a cover. I felt a sickening knot form in my stomach. Was I guarding something? Or was I just the disposable guy who was in the way? I immediately checked the radio. I could hear static, muffled chatter from Forest Service channels, but when I tried to transmit, I got nothing but dead air. The scrambler hadn't just been provided, it was active. My radio was likely disabled, preventing me from calling out or reporting the odd delivery. I spent the rest of the day in a rising tide of paranoia, moving the strange contents of the crate inside the cabin, hiding the metal detectors and the maps under my cot. I kept glancing at the landing pad, half expecting the helicopter to return and retrieve whatever I was supposed to be hiding. That night I couldn't sleep. The wind was howling, rattling the glass of the observation deck. I was on my cot, staring at the ceiling, when I heard something that was not the wind. It was a faint scraping sound, metal on rock. I slid off the cot, my heart leaping into my throat. The only way to the cabin was the narrow, steep trail I'd hiked up. If someone was here, they weren't supposed to be. I crept up the ladder to the observation deck. I pressed my face against the cold glass, peering out into the moonless, terrifying blackness. I couldn't see anything, but the scraping sound was closer now, punctuated by the heavy, rhythmic thud of a boot on the rocky incline. Someone was ascending the plateau. I frantically searched the small cabin for something to use as a weapon. All I had was the heavy crowbar I'd used to open the crate. I grabbed it, the cold steel feeling both useless and comforting in my hand. I flipped the switch on the outside floodlight, a powerful beam meant to mark the helipad. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the last few yards of the trail. 2 figures. They were bulky, dressed in dark tactical gear, carrying enormous backpacks. They paused, momentarily blinded by the sudden light, their heads swiveling toward the cabin. They weren't hikers, They weren't rangers, they looked like professional operators. Did they know I was here? Were they the reason for the scrambler? I didn't wait to find out. I killed the floodlight, plunging the plateau back into absolute blackness, and dove back down the ladder, my twisted ankle protesting fiercely. I bolted the heavy steel door to the living quarters. It was a flimsy defense, but it was all I had. I grabbed the shortwave radio, flipping switches, desperately trying to bypass the scrambler. The voices were already outside. Low, urgent murmurs, the thump of their heavy packs hitting the rock near the door. "He's here," a voice hissed, muffled through the thin metal. "Check the antenna. He might have tried to transmit." I knew I was in trouble. They weren't coming for the job, they were coming for something else. Something I had inadvertently been hired to sit on top of. A few seconds later, a loud, sustained whirring sound started right outside the door. A battery-powered circular saw. They were cutting the hinges. I had no time. I grabbed the crowbar and one of the large, rolled-up topographical maps, scrambling up to the observation deck. I smashed the glass of the window facing away from the trail, the one overlooking a sheer, 500-foot drop. The door burst open with a screech of tortured metal below. Heavy boots thudded onto the wooden floor. "He's on the upper deck. Go, go." I swung the crowbar and smashed out the remaining glass in the window opening. The wind rushed in, a powerful, icy hand. I couldn't climb down the cliff. I had to create a distraction. I grabbed the heavy crowbar one last time, aimed it at the largest, most expensive-looking piece of equipment, the panoramic telescopic camera, and swung with all my strength. The camera exploded into a shower of plastic and wires. Alarms immediately began to shriek, a high-pitched, insistent electronic whine that echoed across the valley. That would buy me seconds, maybe a minute. I slipped out the broken window, onto the narrow, metal walkway that circled the deck. The men were shouting my name now, their voices hard and threatening. "Mark, stop! You don't want to do this." I didn't try to run to the trail. I wouldn't make it. My only option was the zip line. Mountain Logistics had installed a heavy, industrial zip line for emergency personnel, a thick, steel cable running from the plateau down to a designated logging road 400 feet below. It was never meant for civilian use, and I knew nothing about its maintenance. I pulled the emergency safety harness from its box, a complex arrangement of webbing and carabiners, and clipped it to the main line. It felt flimsy, fragile. The first man burst through the deck door. He was carrying a rifle. "Don't move, you'll break your neck." I didn't hesitate. I pushed off the platform into the terrifying void. Part I, the descent and the discovery. The plunge was sickening. The wind shrieked past my ears. The cable sang a high-tension metallic whine. I was plummeting into the darkness, holding on for dear life, the rough steel cable biting into the leather of my gloves. The line was meant to slow me, but I was going too fast, a blur accelerating toward the forest floor. I saw the flash of the man's rifle in the dark. He fired a shot. The bullet hissed past my head, impacting the rock face of the mountain. I braced myself, tightening my grip just before I reached the end of the line. The heavy industrial spring at the terminal snapped the carriage to a violent halt. The impact threw me forward, slamming my chest against the rigging. I gasped, coughing the stale, thin air back out. I was suspended 10 feet above a muddy, rutted logging road. I unclipped the harness and dropped the last 10 feet, landing hard in the mud. I grabbed the rolled-up map, which I'd somehow managed to keep tucked under my arm, and scrambled into the darkness of the surrounding woods. I didn't stop running until I had reached the relative cover of a dense grove of towering hemlocks, miles away from the mountain base. I collapsed, trying to slow my ragged breathing. They wouldn't follow me immediately. Not on foot, not in the dark. They would assume I was running for help. I pulled out the map. I had to know what was worth this risk, this violence. I unrolled the map with trembling hands. It wasn't a military installation or a drug lab. It showed a patch of deep, untouched wilderness in the valley below, an area so remote it was labeled as a conservation reserve. The large red X was printed over a small, isolated area, no more than 100 yards across, near a dry creek bed. Beside the X, written in faint, precise script, were two words: the deposit. The deposit. What was deposited here, and why was my job to watch for smoke above it? The adrenaline was starting to fade, replaced by a cold, calculating fear. These people were organized, armed, and ready to kill an unarmed civilian over whatever this deposit was. I had to get away, but running wasn't enough. I had to know what I was running from. I had one of the metal detectors from the crate, and I had the map. Maybe they were after me because I had seen the crate's contents, or maybe they were after me because they thought I knew where the deposit was. I made a terrible decision, fueled by reckless curiosity and the survival instinct that demanded I understand the threat. I would use the cover of the wilderness to circle back to the X marked on the map. I needed answers, not rescue. It took me all night and most of the next day to traverse the rugged terrain. I navigated using the map and the scant sunlight filtering through the canopy. I was running on fumes, hunger gnawing at my empty stomach, my chest bruised from the zip line impact. Late in the afternoon, I found the creek bed dry, filled with smooth river stones. I was at the location of the X. The area looked perfectly ordinary. Just a patch of forest floor, thick with pine needles and moss, ringed by large, ancient boulders. I pulled out the metal detector. It was heavy, and I felt utterly ridiculous holding it, a trespasser looking for buried treasure. I powered it up. It whined to life, and I began to sweep the ground methodically. For 10 minutes, nothing but static. I was about to give up, concluding that the map was a hoax or that the deposit had been moved. Then the machine shrieked, a loud, sustained, high-pitched tone that vibrated through the handle. I dropped the machine and started digging frantically with my hands. The earth was soft and loose, disturbed by recent activity. I hit something hard after only a foot of digging. It wasn't a chest or a weapon, it was a vault door. Small, circular, and made of gleaming, thick steel, set flush with the ground. It had a heavy, 5-digit combination lock embedded in its center. It was utterly out of place, a piece of high-security engineering buried beneath a mossy rock in the middle of nowhere. I sank back, staring at it, my mind reeling. This wasn't a fire watch. This was an active security detail. Mountain Logistics had paid me to be a distraction, a scapegoat, or simply a temporary, naive guard. And the men who chased me were either competitors, or they were sent by my employers to retrieve the deposit after I'd served my purpose. I had no way to open the vault, no combination. I stood up, leaning against a nearby boulder, trying to make sense of the overwhelming dread. And that's when I saw it. On the side of the boulder facing the buried vault was a tiny, faded carving. It wasn't a triangle this time, but a number, the number 4. A moment later, I found a second carving on another boulder, obscured by moss, the number 2. Then a third, the number 9. I checked the remaining boulders, sweeping moss and lichen away, until I found 4 more digits, 1 and 5. 5 numbers, 42915. A combination. I had no logical reason to believe this was the code, but I had nothing to lose. I knelt down, my heart hammering, and began to turn the dial, 42915. A soft, mechanical clunk resonated from the vault door. The lock had disengaged. I reached out and pulled the handle. The small vault door swung open with a smooth, silent sigh of escaping air. I braced myself for gold or cash or smuggled jewels, but the contents of the vault were far stranger, far more unnerving. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark velvet, was a single obsidian black stone. It was perfectly smooth, egg-shaped, and completely devoid of reflection. It wasn't large. It fit easily in the palm of my hand. It radiated cold, a bone-deep cold that felt unnatural, like an absence of heat rather than mere low temperature. As I stared at it, I noticed a faint, almost invisible, shifting pattern just beneath the surface of the black stone. It wasn't a reflection. It was a slow, pulsing movement within the object itself. What is it? Why are people willing to kill for a black rock? My hand, on a pure, reckless impulse, reached into the vault. I picked up the stone. The moment my fingers closed around the obsidian, the world seemed to tip. A powerful, non-physical pressure slammed into my mind. I gasped, stumbling backward. The noise of the forest vanished, replaced by a deafening, echoing silence. And then I saw the face. It was not a memory or a hallucination. It was an image superimposed onto my vision, a fleeting, horrific, distorted image of a woman's face, screaming, her features stretched and terrified. It lasted less than a second, then vanished. I dropped the stone with a cry of pure, instinctual horror. It didn't break. It landed with a dull, heavy thud on the vault's velvet lining. Whatever this object was, it wasn't just metal or mineral. It was tied to something terrifyingly psychological, something that could project a single, devastating moment of pure terror directly into my consciousness. Was this a memory? Was it a record of the last person who touched it? I heard the sound then, not the men I'd escaped. This was different. A heavy, low thrumming. It was the distinct sound of a heavy-duty truck engine laboring uphill on the distant logging road. They were coming back. They had tracked me, or they had simply decided to secure the deposit again. I slammed the vault door shut and twisted the combination dial randomly, knowing they would break it open easily, but needing the extra seconds. I covered the area with dirt and leaves, but it was a pathetic attempt at concealment. I grabbed the metal detector and ran. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs turned to rubber. I knew the men would be here soon. They weren't after a lost civilian anymore. They were after an intruder who had accessed their property. I finally reached a small, abandoned hunting cabin miles from the deposit. It was a rotting structure, barely more than a four-sided shell, but it offered cover. I crawled into the dusty darkness under the floorboards, pulling brush and rotten logs over the opening. I lay there listening for what felt like eternity. Around midnight, I heard them, not one truck but two. Their headlights swept the surrounding trees. I could hear their methodical, quiet movements, their voices muffled by the distance. They were professionals. They were hunting me. "He's got the map," one voice stated clearly, chillingly close. "Find the map, he'll be weak. He hasn't eaten." "The director wants to know if he touched it," the second voice replied. A terrifying thought struck me. If I had simply run away, they would have eventually given up. But by finding and opening the vault, by touching the stone, I had done something irreparable. I had become contaminated. I had become evidence. A terrible smell hit me then, not natural forest rot, but the sickly sweet smell of gasoline. I realized what they were doing. They weren't searching for me door to door. They were going to burn the area. Burn the forest, burn the cabin, burn me, clean up the contamination. I heard the splash of liquid on the rotten wood. The smell was overpowering. My lungs constricted. I had only seconds. I pushed out from under the floorboards and bolted, choking into the dark forest. There he is, moving, get him. The forest lit up with the brilliant flash of a high-powered flashlight. I was blinded. I ran, stumbling blindly through the thicket. I heard the crackle and roar behind me as the cabin instantly went up in flames, a terrifying, greedy inferno. I ran toward the deepest part of the forest, using the massive, ancient trees as cover. They were gaining on me. I heard the heavy, rhythmic pounding of their boots and the clicking of their equipment. I dove behind a massive, moss-covered redwood. As I did, my hand closed around a loose piece of equipment in the mud. It was the metal detector. I hadn't even realized I was still carrying it. I had one final, desperate, idiotic idea. I turned the metal detector on, pointing the large sensor coil behind me toward the two men who were closing in. I cranked the volume dial to maximum. The moment the machine powered up, the entire area was flooded with a howling, piercing, electronic feedback shriek. The sound was so loud, so high-pitched, it felt like a spike driven through my skull. The men screamed, curses swallowed by the noise. They stumbled, clutching their ears, dropping their flashlights. They weren't expecting this deafening, localized weapon. I took off again, running down the hill, away from the shrieking machine. I ran until the noise became a distant, muffled whine, until the glare of the burning cabin was just a faint orange stain on the night sky. I kept running, pushing through the thick, terrifying dark, until I finally hit a road, a proper paved road, a highway miles and miles away from the Deep Creek Fire Watch. I didn't stop until I flagged down a passing truck driver, who was shocked to find a bruised, bleeding, half-crazed man staggering out of the woods, babbling about black stones and hidden vaults. I'm safe now. They called the police. The police didn't find the deposit or the men. They only found the burned cabin and a massive area of scorched earth they blamed on an illegal campfire. I know the truth. I know what I saw in that stone, the fear, the screaming face. It felt like a warning, a fragment of a trapped soul, and every time I close my eyes, I see that fleeting, horrific image. And the question that haunts me, that I will never get an answer to, is, what exactly was contained in that black stone that required a 5-digit combination lock, a secret map, and my life as an expendable distraction? And was that face I saw the true deposit? They say the Appalachian Trail is a friendly place, full of helpful strangers and shared camaraderie. I'd always believed it, which is why I was slackpacking a small section in North Carolina, a 4-day solo trip to prove to myself that I hadn't become a complete slave to my desk job. I was a few miles past the last designated shelter, aiming for a small, unnamed pond I'd seen on an old forestry map. The air was humid, thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. I arrived at the pond just as the sun began to dip into the trees. It was spectacular, a sheet of dark, still water reflecting the bruised evening sky, entirely enclosed by steep, silent mountainsides, utterly isolated. I set up my ultralight tent near the shore, making sure my food bag was secured high up a nearby hemlock branch. I was boiling water for my freeze-dried dinner when I noticed the tree. It was a giant oak, standing sentinel between my tent and the pond. Its bark was rough and deeply ridged, and on one of those ridges, someone had carved a single, vertical line. It was thin, faint, and almost invisible unless you were looking for it. A simple tally mark. A hiker marking a waypoint. I wondered. But it wasn't near the trail, and it wasn't the standard AT blaze. I dismissed it as old graffiti and started eating, the beef stroganoff tasting surprisingly good after the long hike. The night was intensely dark. No moon, just the cold, diamond sprawl of the stars overhead. The quiet was absolute, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the occasional splash from the pond. I was settling into my sleeping bag, reading by the glow of my headlamp, when I heard the sound. It was incredibly subtle, almost lost in the white noise of the woods. A light, deliberate scraping noise, like metal against wood, coming from the direction of the old oak tree. My heart immediately seized up. I froze, holding my breath, listening with every fiber of my being. It's a raccoon, a deer rubbing its antlers. I tried to rationalize it, but the sound was too rhythmic, too intentional. It went scrape, silence, scrape. I slowly unzipped the tent window just enough to peer out. I shone my headlamp toward the oak. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the tree trunk. I didn't see an animal. I saw the tally mark. And beside it, where the faint line had been, there were now two vertical lines. A new one, fresh and stark, cutting slightly deeper into the bark than the first. The exposed wood looked pale white in the headlamp beam. Someone or something had been standing right there after I set up my camp and added a mark to the tree. My rational mind screamed, "This is a person. Someone is out here." But the mark felt so unnervingly deliberate, placed right next to my tent. I pulled the flap shut, my hands shaking. I didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. Was the mark for me? Was it counting something? I didn't sleep again. When the first gray light of dawn broke, I shot out of my tent and stumbled over to the oak. The lines were still there, two clean, vertical marks. They were real. I scanned the ground. The soil was loose and covered in pine needles, but I saw no clear footprints. Whoever made the mark was either exceptionally light on their feet or was meticulous in covering their tracks. I decided my only option was to pack up and get out. The idea of staying another hour made my skin crawl. This wasn't a prank, this felt like a threat, a violation. I was rolling up my sleeping bag when I noticed the second anomaly. On the other side of the pond, maybe 150 yards away, nestled against the far ridge line, was a small, almost perfectly circular area where the vegetation looked unnaturally flat, as if something very large and very heavy had rested there for an extended period. And right in the center of that flattened area, there was a flash of white. I pulled out my binoculars. The white wasn't trash. It was a metal folding chair, the kind you'd see at an outdoor wedding or a cheap conference. It was facing directly across the pond, pointed straight at my campsite. And beside the chair, hammered into the earth, was a long, thin metal stake. The hair stood up on the back of my neck. Someone hadn't just hiked past. Someone had set up a long-term observation post across the pond. Had they been there all night, watching me? Had they walked the entire perimeter of the pond just to carve the mark? My fear suddenly shifted from simple apprehension to cold, hard dread. This was calculated. The tally marks, the chair, the silence. It was all designed to communicate something without speaking. I packed the rest of my gear in a frenzy, throwing things into my pack with no regard for organization. As I cinched the straps, I looked back at the oak tree. The two marks seemed to stare back at me. I started hiking, power walking away from the pond and back toward the familiar AT trail. I didn't stop to drink or rest for over 2 hours. I just kept my eyes glued to the map, counting down the miles until I hit civilization. I reached a small, dilapidated lean-to I recognized from the trail maps. It was a relief, a sign that I was back on track. I slumped against the rough-hewn bench inside, pulling out my water bottle. I felt safer here. This was a known hiker spot. Someone might pass through. I took a deep, shuddering breath. I looked up at the wooden support beam holding up the roof of the shelter. It was covered in years of hiker graffiti, names, dates, small carvings. And there, right at eye level, was a fresh carving. It was 3 vertical lines. The same size, the same depth, the same chilling precision as the marks on the oak tree by the pond. I shot to my feet, spinning around, peering into the woods. My hands were slick with sweat. How did they get here so fast? Did they somehow anticipate where I was going? The shelter was 2 miles from the pond, but the marked tree was 10 feet from the trail. If the person who made the marks was moving faster than me, bypassing the winding path, they could have easily reached this point before I did. I wasn't being followed, I was being anticipated. But the chilling question was, what happens when the tally reaches 5? Was this counting time, counting landmarks, or counting something else entirely? I couldn't stay. I didn't dare leave anything behind. I checked my pack one last time, my eyes flicking nervously toward the forest. And then I saw the final, sick twist. On the ground, resting innocently near the fire pit, was a small, folded piece of thick cardstock, a business card. I picked it up. It was heavy, textured paper. There was no name, no number, just a single disturbing image. A simple, hand-drawn stick figure with two small, perfectly round dots for eyes. The stick figure was smiling. I stared at the drawing. It felt like a piece of evidence, a final confirmation that this wasn't random, that this person wanted me to know they were here. And the smiling, blank-faced stick figure was watching me. I sprinted from the shelter, the business card crushed in my hand, running until the sound of my own pounding heart was the only thing I could hear. I didn't look back for a fourth mark. I just ran, trying to outrun the chilling symmetry of the tally marks and the quiet, unblinking surveillance of the person who put them there. I'm home now. The terror has faded into a dull, constant anxiety, but I keep the card, and every time I open my wallet, I see the smiling, silent stick figure and I wonder, did they stop counting when I made it off the trail, or did the fourth mark go up the moment I reached pavement? And if so, where will they carve the fifth? I told my wife, Claire, I was going alone to clear my head. The truth was, I needed to meet someone. Not a friend, but a necessary evil. I drove 6 hours to the base of the Black Gorge, an isolated state park known for its treacherous ravines and zero oversight. I parked my SUV exactly where I was instructed, a dusty, unmarked turnout 5 miles past the official gate, obscured by thick stands of sickly-looking juniper trees. The reason for the meeting was simple: money laundering. Not mine, but a desperate, one-time favor for a man named Leo, who had muscle and influence I was terrified of. I was supposed to hike in a mile to the designated spot, receive a duffel bag of cash, sit on it for 48 hours in the remotest part of the gorge, and then meet a different courier to hand it off. The fee was enough to pay off my mortgage. The risk was terrifying, but the debt to Leo was non-negotiable. I hiked in just before dusk, finding the clearing where I was supposed to meet the initial courier. It was a bowl-shaped depression in the earth, silent and suffocatingly dark once the sun went down. Leo's courier, a small, wiry man I knew only as Gus, was already there. He didn't look up when I arrived, simply sitting cross-legged next to a military-grade duffel bag, its canvas stretched tight. "You're late," Gus mumbled, not bothering to hide the accusation. "Traffic," I lied, knowing the route had been empty. Gus stood, finally meeting my gaze. His eyes were flat, disinterested. He lifted the bag and pushed it toward me with his foot. It was heavier than I expected. Not just money heavy, but dense, like it contained something more than bundled cash. "Hold on to it. Don't open it. Don't touch the straps. The code changes at dawn on Sunday. You miss the drop, you forfeit the payment," he recited in a monotone, clearly bored with the ritual. "Got it," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "One more thing," Gus said, his eyes finally flickering with something approaching interest. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, metallic object. It looked like a standard GPS tracker, the kind used to follow shipping containers. "This stays with the bag. It's active. If you move more than 3 miles from this location before Sunday, you'll have company. Bad company." He didn't wait for a response. He turned and melted back into the shadows of the gorge walls, moving with a silent efficiency that only deepened my anxiety. I was alone, sitting next to a massive, locked duffel bag containing God knows what, miles from civilization, with an active tracker broadcasting my exact coordinates to Leo's people. This wasn't a camping trip, it was a cage. I set up my tent 30 feet from the bag, knowing it was a pointless gesture. I tried to build a small fire, seeking the comfort of a small, controllable light, but the wood was damp and the effort felt exhausting. I lay in my tent, the duffel bag a black, heavy presence outside the mesh, radiating a silent threat. I kept staring at the fabric of the tent, imagining Leo's men huddled around a screen, watching a tiny blinking icon that was me. Around midnight, a terrifying curiosity took hold. Was it really just cash? The weight was wrong. The shape was too rigid. and why the military-grade lock and the strict instruction not to touch the straps. I knew I shouldn't, but the temptation, the need to verify the magnitude of the risk I had taken, overwhelmed my common sense. I unzipped my tent and crawled out to the bag. I ran my hands over the rough canvas. I could feel the edges of what felt like tightly packed bricks inside. Not paper currency, but something solid. I ran my hand over the handle, a thick braided nylon strap. As I did, my fingers brushed against the underside of the handle and I felt something unexpected. A single, short slit in the nylon, hidden from casual view. I carefully pulled the cut threads apart. Tucked deep inside the hollow strap, where it wouldn't be found by a cursory search, was a small, tightly rolled piece of paper. I unrolled it under the faint light of my headlamp. It wasn't a code, it was a photograph. A color photo, slightly faded. It was a snapshot of a child, a young girl, maybe 10 years old, smiling widely, sitting on a swing set. Written neatly on the back in faint ballpoint pen was a single name and date: Sarah, 1998. My blood ran cold. This wasn't about money. This wasn't a simple handoff. The duffel bag, the specific instructions, the photo hidden in the strap. This was a delivery with a message, a terrifying, deeply personal threat. I quickly rolled the photo back up, tucking it into the strap, and backed away from the bag, wiping my fingerprints frantically on my pants. Was this girl's life the collateral, or was the cash itself the payment for something far more sinister? I finally got a fire going, a small, pathetic defense against the engulfing darkness. I stared into the flames, seeing the smiling face of the girl in the photograph superimposed onto the flickering orange. I was no longer a courier. I was an accomplice to a nightmare. The next day, Saturday, was spent in psychological torment. I didn't move the bag. I didn't stray more than a few hundred yards from the clearing. I felt the paranoia tightening around me, a physical pressure. Every snap of a twig, every hawk's cry felt like Leo's men closing in. I was determined to find a way out. I was not going to be part of whatever horrible transaction was linked to that photograph. I pulled out my satellite phone, the one I had insisted on bringing as a precaution. I flipped it on and the small screen glowed to life, desperately searching for a signal. No bars, as expected. The gorge walls were too steep, too dense. Then I remembered the radio I had brought, a small, handheld two-way radio used for emergency backcountry communication. I started flipping through the channels, tuning the squelch, hopping to catch a stray signal from a local trucker or a park ranger. I hit an unknown frequency, not static but a faint, rhythmic beep, a low, steady electronic pulse. It wasn't a voice or a song, it was a beacon. I realized with a sickening jolt that it wasn't the GPS tracker on the bag that was broadcasting the beep. It was my radio, picking up a signal coming from somewhere else. I stood up slowly, turning the radio antenna like a dowsing rod. The closer I aimed the antenna to the northern gorge wall, the louder and clearer the beep became. It was coming from maybe a quarter-mile away, high up the steep, rocky slope. Is that the tracker on the duffel bag? No, the bag was 10 feet away, and my radio wouldn't be tuned to that frequency. Is it the second courier, checking in early? I started toward the gorge wall, my curiosity, my need to understand the source of the danger, overriding my safety instincts. I took the radio, leaving the duffel bag exactly where it was. It took 20 minutes of scrambling over loose rock and thorny bushes to reach the base of the sheer wall. I looked up. The signal was definitely coming from above. I found a narrow, almost invisible path, a small goat trail winding its way up the rock face. I started climbing, using my hands and knees, the radio clutched in my belt. After maybe 50 feet of climbing, I reached a small, horizontal shelf, a rocky overhang barely large enough to stand on. The beeping was now loud, insistent. And there, wedged into a shallow crevice, hidden from below, was a second GPS tracker. identical to the one Gus had pointed out on the duffel bag. This one was attached, not to a bag but to a small, laminated sheet of paper. I pulled it free, my hands shaking. The sheet of paper wasn't a map, it wasn't a threat. It was a single typed sheet, a full-page detailed alibi. It listed a specific set of activities for Mark. My name, from Friday evening to Sunday morning. Mark cooked beans at 8 p.m. Mark read The Great Gatsby from 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. Mark slept from 12 a.m. to 6 a.m. And so on, filling every hour of the 48-hour period with mundane, innocent details. This tracker wasn't to ensure I didn't run with the money. It was a witness. Leo's organization had planted this second tracker to record my precise movements, verifying that I had stayed in the clearing and had done nothing but sit there, cementing my perfectly innocent alibi. The radio signal was simply a check to ensure the alibi tracker was transmitting. My panic reached a new, chilling level. The money laundering, the courier, the tracker, it was all designed to place me, innocently and immovably, at this precise, unwatched location for a full 48 hours. What specific event required a perfect, verifiable alibi for me, 6 hours away from my home, this exact weekend? I realized the horrifying truth. The duffel bag wasn't the crime. It was the bait. I was the alibi. And whatever they had done or were going to do was far away, and they needed me fixed in place with a clear, time-stamped record of my innocence. I looked down at the tiny, smiling face of the girl in the photograph, hidden in the strap. Was she the motive? Was she the victim? I had to get out. The idea of being a perfect alibi for an unknown, monstrous crime was unbearable. I ripped the alibi tracker from the paper, crushing it in my fist. I threw it down the rock face, listening for the faint crunch of plastic on rock. I scrambled back down the trail, running on adrenaline. I reached the clearing, the duffel bag sitting there, heavy and accusatory. The second courier was due at dawn. I had less than 10 hours. I grabbed my pack, throwing the essentials in. I grabbed the duffel bag. Against all instructions, I put it on my shoulder. I didn't care about the tracker. I had to get the bag and its terrifying contents to a place where I could break it open, find out what was truly inside, and report it. I didn't know what I would find, but I couldn't simply hand over whatever was in that bag after seeing the photograph and the alibi tracker. I started running toward the logging road, forcing myself to move despite the heavy, clumsy weight of the duffel bag on my shoulder. I didn't look back at the perfect, empty clearing. But as I stumbled out of the gorge, the duffel bag banging against my hip, I heard a faint, persistent noise, the chime of a phone notification. It wasn't my phone, it was coming from the duffel bag. I dropped it instantly, recoiling. The chime sounded again, short and sharp. It wasn't a standard ringtone, it was a text message alert. The duffel bag had a phone inside, a phone that had just received a message. Was the real courier informing the contents of the bag that I was moving, or was someone inside the bag trying to communicate? I stood frozen in the gathering darkness, staring at the humming, chiming duffel bag, the terrifying weight of the unspoken crime pressing down on me. I knew, with sickening certainty, that if I opened it now, the truth would be revealed, but my life would be forfeit. The chilling reality of this choice, ignorance and survival, or knowledge and death, was the final, devastating gift of the gorge. My brother Ethan and I had a tradition, a multi-day hike every October to the same remote spot in the Bitterroot Mountains. It was a rugged, 9-mile ascent to a high alpine lake called Coldwater Tarn. The tarn was ringed by granite peaks, and the only trail was barely a game path. It was a place for total silence. This year, however, felt different. Our relationship was frayed, strained by months of professional rivalry, a terrible, silent tension that sat between us like a third person. We had decided, without discussing it, that a complete separation would be best for the trip. We would hike up together, but we'd camp 200 yards apart on opposite sides of the tarn. A shared location, but distinct, separate campsites. It was awkward, hiking in silence, two strangers with the same backpack model. We reached the tarn just before the clouds rolled in, turning the air bone-achingly cold. "I'll take the North Shore," Ethan mumbled, dropping his pack. His voice was flat, emotionless. "Fine," I replied. "I'll take the South. See you on the trail out Sunday." We didn't look at each other. He started off around the lake, a dark silhouette against the gray water. I headed toward my usual spot, a small, rocky shelf overlooking the tarn's outlet stream. I set up camp quickly. As the last bit of light failed, I looked across the water. I couldn't see Ethan's tent, but I could see the glow of his headlamp, a small, steady point of light confirming his presence. That glow, oddly, was a comfort. It meant I wasn't completely alone up here. I cooked a meager dinner, staring into the flickering light of my tiny fire. The wind started to whip, howling down from the peaks, bringing with it a fine mist of rain. I secured everything and retreated to my sleeping bag, exhausted but unable to shake the feeling of profound isolation. I woke up abruptly at some unknown hour. The wind was a solid wall of noise, shaking the tent violently. My heart was pounding, not from fear, but from the sudden, jarring noise. I reached for my phone, which was powered off in a dry bag, and fumbled for my watch. 3 a.m. I shone my headlamp out through the tiny mesh window. Rain was sheeting down, illuminated by the beam. And then I looked across the tarn. The light was gone. Ethan's headlamp, that small, steady, comforting glow, was not there. He turned it off. That was the most logical answer. He was asleep or reading with the lamp inside his sleeping bag. But the sudden absence, coupled with the violence of the wind, felt like a warning. I lay awake until 5 a.m., the wind gradually dying down to a persistent moan. I decided I would wait until first light, then hike over and check on him. The sun rose slowly, a weak, watery light trying to penetrate the mist. I grabbed my rain shell and hurried around the edge of the tarn toward the North Shore. I reached the site where Ethan always camped. It was a small, perfectly flat patch of earth, sheltered by a large, leaning pine. There was no tent. I stopped dead, the wet, cold air suddenly burning in my lungs. The ground was undisturbed. There were no depressions where a tent might have been pitched, no telltale scrapes from poles, no stones used to hold down the fly. The earth was soft, mossy, and completely untouched. The campsite looked like no one had ever been there. My mind instantly cycled through explanations. Number 1, I got the wrong spot. Impossible. This was the only flat, sheltered spot on this side of the tarn. Number 2, he packed up early. Ridiculous. It was 6 a.m., still raining lightly, and the trail out was a brutal 9 miles. No one breaks camp in the dead of night unless they are running from something. Number 3, he set up somewhere else. Why? We agreed on the North Shore, and why would he vanish without a word? I walked the entire North Shore perimeter, scanning the ground. I found no gear, no fire pit, no footprints, nothing to indicate that Ethan or anyone had been there. It was as if the glowing light I'd seen at 10 p.m. was a phantom, a figment of my weary imagination. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. I saw the light. I felt the relief of his presence. I rushed back to my own camp, grabbing my binoculars and climbing onto the highest point of my rocky shelf. I scanned the entire area, the ridges, the peaks, the trail leading in. Nothing but rock and saturated pine. Then I checked the spot where I had last seen his headlamp glow. I raised the binoculars, focusing on the dark patch of ground. I saw something I hadn't noticed before, a faint, narrow track leading away from the water, up the nearly vertical scree slope of the nearest granite peak. It was too faint to be a trail, too deliberate to be a game path. It looked like something heavy had been dragged. My heart was now a desperate, frantic drum against my ribs. I grabbed my pack, throwing in only the bare essentials: water, map, a knife. Leaving my tent standing, I set off, scrambling up the terrifyingly steep slope, following the faint drag mark. The climb was exhausting, treacherous. The drag marks were sporadic, visible only where a loose rock had been displaced or a patch of fragile moss had been torn up. They led me upward, away from the relative safety of the tarn, toward the bald, windswept summit. After 45 minutes of brutal climbing, I crested the final boulder, pulling myself onto the smooth, barren plateau. The wind here was insane, screaming across the rock, tearing at my clothing. I scanned the summit. And there he was, Ethan. He was lying motionless, face down 50 feet away from me. He was wearing his hiking clothes, but his pack was gone. His body was unnaturally still, arms splayed out on the cold granite. I scrambled toward him, shouting his name, the sound instantly shredded by the wind. I reached him and rolled him over. He was pale, his eyes closed, but he was breathing shallow, ragged breaths. He was alive but deeply unconscious. There was no visible trauma, no blood, no sign of a fall. But there was something else. Tucked tightly into his hand, gripped with desperate force, was a small, smooth, gray river stone. It was ordinary except for one thing: a single, thin, vertical scratch across its surface. I shook him, frantically checking his pulse, his clothes. "Ethan, what happened? Where's your camp? Where's your tent?" He didn't respond. He just muttered something, a low, guttural noise barely audible over the wind. I leaned closer, cupping my hand around his ear. He repeated the phrase, his voice a dry, rasping whisper. "It took the frame. It took the frame." I looked around the summit. It was completely empty. No structure, no shelter, just cold rock and wind. I turned back to Ethan, trying to grasp what he meant. His mind was clearly shattered, delirious. Then I saw it. Just beyond him, anchored into a small crevice in the rock, were 4 thick, braided ropes. They were taut, pulled absolutely rigid. Anchored to 4 separate boulders surrounding the area. They were thick enough to secure a large piece of equipment. But there was nothing attached to the ropes. No tent, no tarp, no structure. This wasn't a camping spot. This was a mooring. I looked closer at the ground between the anchor points. There was a faint but distinct outline, a rectangle of disturbed lichen and grit, precisely the size and shape of a large, multi-person tent base. Someone or something had violently ripped the tent fabric and fly right off the frame, leaving the ropes and the pegs still anchored in the rock. The tent fabric, the rain fly, the inner mesh, they were all gone, vanished into the wind or taken. I looked at the stone in Ethan's hand, the single tally mark. A chilling realization struck me. Ethan didn't break camp. He had set up a trap. Had he known someone was up here? Had he deliberately separated us, offering me up as bait, while he camped higher to observe? I pulled my satellite phone from my pack, the irony of using emergency technology to call for help against an unknown threat not lost on me. I turned it on. Predictably, no signal. I was alone on a high, silent peak, with my unconscious brother and the chilling evidence of a crime. An empty set of anchor ropes and a single marked stone. And then I heard it, a faint, clicking sound coming from the north ridge. It was the same sound I had heard at my own campsite hours ago, obscured by the wind and my denial. I looked down at Ethan's hand, still clutching the stone. I looked at the bare, flat ground where his tent should have been, the single, faint scratch on the stone. The question that sent a paralyzing jolt of horror through me was, if the entire tent fabric was ripped off and vanished, and the frame was taken, what exactly was it that Ethan saw or was communicating with from inside his tent before he was silenced? And was the sound I was hearing now, the clicking, the approach of the thing that took the frame? I looked down at my own hand, pulling the knife from my pocket, knowing that whatever came up here wasn't human and certainly wasn't friendly. I was next on the tally. I had come to Clearwater Lake for one reason: to collect what my Uncle Marcus had left me. Marcus was a paranoid hermit, convinced the government was watching his every move, which is why he lived for 20 years completely off-grid in a homemade shack on the far side of this massive glacial lake. He died a month ago, leaving a cryptic message in his will. The balance awaits at the usual spot. The usual spot was the campsite we used when I visited him as a kid, a small, hidden beach accessible only by boat or an 8-mile bushwhack. I opted for the boat, rowing a battered aluminum dinghy across the choppy, cold water. I reached the beach just as the fog began to roll in, swallowing the opposite shore and the last of the afternoon light. I pulled the dinghy high onto the sand and started searching the familiar landmarks: the old, wind-blasted pine, the cluster of gray stones, the small, flat area where we always pitched the tent. There was no visible treasure, no buried chest, just the damp, quiet wilderness. I pitched my own small tent for the night, feeling the heavy, expectant silence of the place. I sat by my meager fire, running through the possibilities. Marcus wasn't rich. His balance wasn't monetary. It had to be information or something illegal he'd hidden for safety. I spent an hour digging carefully around the largest of the gray stones, the one we always used as a makeshift table. Nothing. Frustrated, I sat back, running my hand across the rough, cold granite. My fingers caught on something, a shallow, almost imperceptible groove in the rock. I leaned in, examining it with my headlamp. It wasn't natural. It was a single, precisely cut initial, M. Marcus had left a cipher. I started running my hands over the surrounding stones, searching for more carvings. It took 20 frantic minutes, but I found them. 3 other stones, each bearing a single carved initial: IC and E. MICE. Mice, what did that mean? A code, a reference. I looked around the small beach, feeling a sudden, intense pressure, as if I was being watched. The fog was now so thick it felt like being inside a gray cloud. I was entirely alone. I tried to think like Marcus. Paranoia, wilderness, survival. I looked at the initials again. MICE, what if it wasn't a word? What if it was a mnemonic, something related to the environment? I focused on the ice, the lake, Clearwater Lake. I turned my headlamp toward the water, which was black and utterly still under the fog. I noticed a small anomaly near the shore, a cluster of perfectly cylindrical air bubbles breaking the surface, slowly and steadily, like tiny effervescent pearls. That doesn't happen naturally in lake water. The air bubbles were escaping from something submerged. I grabbed my rope, secured it to the old pine, and tied the other end around my waist. The water was shockingly cold, stealing my breath. I waded in, following the line of bubbles. They led me to a spot maybe 10 feet from the shore, where the water was waist-deep. I reached down, probing the silty bottom with my foot, and immediately hit something hard and large. I took a deep breath and plunged my hands into the frigid blackness. My fingers closed around a familiar shape, a military-grade plastic drum, the kind used for storing fuel or chemicals. It was heavy, secured by thick plastic straps. I strained, pulling and dragging it backward until I could heave the drum onto the beach. It was sealed tight, the plastic cool and slick under my wet hands. I found a wrench in my pack and worked the main lid. The air pressure hissed out, loud and startling in the dense fog. I shone my light inside. It wasn't cash or gold, it was guns. Several disassembled semi-automatic rifles, packed meticulously in oil-soaked rags, alongside boxes of high-caliber ammunition. A small, black notebook was tucked into the corner. This was Marcus's balance, not his life savings but his arsenal, an illegal, undeclared cache. I grabbed the notebook first, pulling it free from the damp cloth. I flipped it open. It wasn't a diary, it was a ledger. Faint, neat entries detailed sales and trades of weapons, with dates, locations, and codes instead of names. It was a clear record of illegal arms trafficking, with Marcus, the paranoid hermit, as a central player. The final page contained a single line, circled in red ink. Deposit paid for the final shipment 10/14. Today was October 13th. The final shipment was due tomorrow. The chilling question was, did the people expecting that final shipment know that Marcus was dead? And was the usual spot also the rendezvous point for the collection? The fog, the silence, the utter isolation, it all shifted from being peaceful to being profoundly dangerous. I wasn't collecting an inheritance. I was holding a piece of evidence that could get me killed. I quickly resealed the drum and dragged it back into the trees, shoving it under a pile of wet leaves and branches. I wiped the sand clean, desperately trying to restore the illusion of an empty beach. I retreated to my tent, the ledger clutched in my hand. I had to assume the buyers would show up. I had to get off the lake. But the fog had thickened into an impenetrable wall, making rowing impossible. I was trapped. Around 1 a.m. I heard the sound. Not a boat motor, but something less distinct. A soft, rhythmic churning sound coming from the water. It was the quiet, steady sound of oars. Someone else was rowing across the lake. I extinguished my small fire, grabbed my knife, and flattened myself inside the tent, my heart hammering against my ribs. The churning stopped, then the distinct grating sound of a keel scraping sand. They were on the beach. I heard 2 sets of heavy, deliberate footsteps walking toward my tent. They didn't seem surprised to see it. A man's voice, low and gravelly, sliced through the fog. "Marcus, you hear, the weather's turning." The lack of alarm in his voice told me everything. He wasn't surprised by the tent, he expected it. They expected Marcus to be here. I had maybe 5 seconds before they pulled the zipper. I whispered, as low and weak as possible, hopping to mimic an old, sick man. "Yeah, I'm here. Got a flu, though. Left the package under the big pine like we talked about." The footsteps stopped immediately. A heavy silence settled. "Package?" the gravelly voice said, now infused with a sudden, sharp suspicion. "What package? The final shipment isn't till dawn." I realized my mistake. Marcus wouldn't have used the word package. I had exposed myself. The gravelly voice hardened. "Marcus never gets the flu, and the balance. The balance wasn't the guns, it was the ledger." I heard a sudden shift in the gravelly voice's tone, a sickening, cold realization. He left a trap. He knew he was dead. He left the guns as a decoy. He wanted someone to find the ledger. The second man spoke now, his voice younger, more agitated. "Forget the guns, find the tent. He's right there." I ripped open the back seam of the tent with my knife and scrambled out into the dense fog, rolling behind a massive, wet boulder. The zipper of the tent was yanked open with a violent, tearing sound. "He's gone, get him." I heard the clack-clack of a weapon being readied. I was blind in the fog, but they knew my general location. I didn't run toward the lake or the boat. I ran toward the juniper trees, the dense, thorny scrub that marked the start of the bushwhack trail. As I crashed through the underbrush, I realized the terrifying truth of Marcus's inheritance. The ledger was the real threat, the key to bringing down a whole network. He hadn't given it to me for safety. He had passed on the danger, knowing I would be the one to find the key and inevitably draw the attention of the people who wanted it buried forever. A gunshot cracked through the fog, shockingly loud, followed by the hiss of the bullet impacting a nearby tree. I plunged deeper into the darkness, clutching the soaking wet ledger, now fully aware that I was no longer a civilian on a camping trip, but a designated target on the run, inheriting not money, but a death sentence. The final curiosity gap, which now spurred my panicked escape, was, if the balance was the ledger, and the ledger detailed the final shipment, what was the final shipment, so valuable that its records were worth killing for? And did that shipment involve the very people now hunting me through the fog? My name is Sarah, and I made a mistake. A terrible, life-altering mistake that landed me in a desperate situation. I'm 30, and a few months ago I embezzled a substantial sum from the company I worked for. Not for greed, but to save my dying sister from a medical bill that dwarfed our family's entire worth. The money was untraceable, a phantom, thanks to my IT skills. But the guilt, the constant fear of discovery, was crushing. My plan was to disappear for a week, clear my head, and then figure out my next move. I chose Shadow Peak, a notoriously difficult climb in the Lost River Range. The trail was barely maintained and the summit was usually deserted. My goal was solitude, to drown my fear in the vast, indifferent wilderness. I hiked in, a heavy pack digging into my shoulders, for 2 days before reaching the base of the final ascent. I made camp at a small, tree-lined plateau, planning to summit the next morning. The air was thin, cold, and utterly still. As I was setting up my tent, I noticed something odd. The ground here, covered in pine needles and scattered rocks, had a distinct dark stain near where I intended to pitch. It was roughly circular, maybe 3 feet in diameter, and the needles within it were flattened and discolored, almost black. It looked like old oil or a chemical spill. But out here, miles from anything. I tried to ignore it, nudging a few rocks over the worst of the stain. It smelled faintly of metallic soil, like rust and something else, something vaguely organic and disturbing. I picked a different spot, farther away, but the image of the stain lingered. That night the cold bit deep. I huddled in my sleeping bag, trying to read by headlamp, but my mind kept returning to the stain. What caused it? It felt profoundly out of place. Around midnight, a noise startled me, a faint, repetitive clicking sound. It wasn't the natural sounds of the forest. It was precise, mechanical, coming from somewhere uphill above my campsite. I froze, listening. Click, click, click. Pause, click, click, click. It was methodical, like an old clock winding down or some kind of antiquated machinery. I thought about the dark stain, then the clicking, my embezzlement, my secret. They were all tied together in my paranoid mind. Was this some form of surveillance, some warning? I didn't sleep. I woke up exhausted, the sun a pale, weak disk above the peaks. The clicking sound was gone. I packed up my minimal camp, leaving the dark stain behind me, and started the final, steep climb to the summit of Shadow Peak. The ascent was brutal, all loose scree and exposed rock. It took me 3 grueling hours to reach the flat, barren top. The view was incredible, a panorama of endless mountain ranges, but my eyes were drawn to a different sight. In the center of the summit, where the last of the alpine wildflowers struggled for life, stood a cairn. Not a small, trail-marking pile of stones, but a meticulously constructed tower of flat, gray rocks, almost 7 feet tall. It was too perfect, too deliberately placed to be the work of casual hikers. And balanced precariously on the very top of the cairn was a single, large, flat tablet of slate. I approached it cautiously, the wind whipping at my clothes. The slate tablet was smooth, clean, and perfectly horizontal. And carved into its surface was a single, chilling inscription. Not words, but a list of dates. There were maybe a dozen dates, etched deeply into the rock, each followed by a small, horizontal dash. The dates stretched back years, but the most recent one caught my eye, 10/12. Today was October 13th. The date on the slate was yesterday. My blood ran cold. This wasn't some ancient monument. This was an active, recent record, but a record of what? And what did the dash mean? I stared at the inscription, my mind racing. Then I noticed something else. Resting on a small, flat stone at the base of the cairn, half hidden by a clump of alpine grass, was a small, well-worn leather-bound journal. It was old, the leather cracked, the pages yellowed. My survival instinct screamed, "Leave it alone. Hike down, get out." But the morbid curiosity, the need to know what lay beneath these terrifying symbols, was overwhelming. My crime, my fear, they were pushing me to find answers. I picked up the journal. It felt impossibly heavy in my hands. I opened it. The first few pages were standard expedition notes, weather, routes, wildlife sightings. But then the entries shifted. They became short, cryptic, and increasingly unsettling. One entry dated 5 years ago read, "Found the perfect site. The anvil is secure. The first stone is laid. Cairn started." Another from 3 years ago, "The clicking begins at sundown. The collectors are thorough. They ensure the quality of the specimen before extraction." My hands trembled. Specimen, collectors. What kind of horror was I walking into? I flipped to the most recent entry dated 10/12 Summit. "The specimen is perfect. No interference. The final phase begins. The gift will be delivered at dawn. My duty is complete." And just below that, scratched almost illegibly into the page, was a single disturbing sentence. "The tally for the summit is complete. Now begins the tally for the descent." I dropped the journal, my stomach churning. The cairn, the dates, these specimens. It was all too clearly pointing to something utterly monstrous. This wasn't about hiking. This was about a hidden, terrifying operation. And the stain at my campsite, the clicking, they weren't random. They were part of this horrifying ritual. I looked at the slate tablet again. 10/12, the dash. It wasn't completed. It was waiting for something or someone. My own arrival, my decision to camp, my unwitting search for solitude, had placed me at the center of a terrifying, unfolding event. I didn't care about my sister, my embezzlement, or my fear of discovery anymore. I only cared about getting off this mountain alive. I started scrambling down the scree slope, my pace frantic, heedless of the danger of a fall. I had to get to a signal. I had to call someone, anyone. I reached my campsite, grabbing my tent without bothering to dismantle it, just stuffing the whole thing into my pack. The dark stain seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy now. As I passed the stain, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Tucked under a loose rock at its very edge was a small, almost invisible chip of bone. It was polished smooth, about the size of my thumbnail and clearly human. A bone. The stain wasn't oil. It was where a specimen had been collected. I screamed, a raw, terrified sound, and ran, sliding down the treacherous path, away from the plateau, away from the summit, away from the bone. The sun was already dipping, casting long, predatory shadows. I pushed myself, my lungs burning, my muscles screaming. And then I heard it again, the clicking. This time, it wasn't coming from above. It was coming from behind me, getting steadily louder. Click, click, click. Pause, click, click, click. It was a precise, unhurried sound, as if something was slowly, methodically tracking my escape. I didn't look back. I just ran, my feet pounding against the earth, the dry leaves crackling underfoot. The clicking was relentless, closer and closer. I burst through a thicket of rhododendron and almost plunged over a hidden 20-foot drop-off. I pulled back, skidding to a halt just inches from the edge. The clicking stopped. I was trapped, a sheer drop on one side and whatever was making that clicking sound behind me on the other. I heard a heavy, deliberate step behind me, then another. I slowly turned, my heart a terrified drum. Standing there, maybe 15 feet away, was a figure. Tall, slender, dressed in what looked like faded gray coveralls. Their face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, pulled low. They held something in their hand, something small and metallic, that made the clicking sound. It looked like an old-fashioned Geiger counter or some kind of primitive sensor. They lifted their free hand. In it, they held the slate tablet, the one from the top of the cairn. And with the dull, metallic edge of a small knife, they slowly, deliberately, completed the dash next to the date 10/12. They drew a short, vertical line, making it a complete tally mark. Then with the same deliberate motion, they carved a new date below it, 1013. And the figure looked at me, tilting their head. I couldn't see their eyes, but I felt the immense, cold weight of their gaze. They held up the Geiger counter. It wasn't clicking anymore. It was emitting a low, continuous hum, a steady, vibrating hum that echoed the terrifying realization in my own mind. The specimen, the collection, the gift. The hum was my signature, the signal. I realized the horrifying truth. This entire ritual, the cairn, the dates, the clicking, it wasn't about observing an event. It was about observing a person. My descent wasn't an escape. It was part of their final phase. They hadn't caught me yet. They had herded me. The figure took a slow, measuring step toward me. The slate tablet with the freshly carved date and the ominous, unfinished dash seemed to pulse in their hand. My embezzlement, my desperate act to save my sister, had somehow inadvertently marked me as a specimen for something ancient and terrifying on Shadow Peak. The gift wasn't something being delivered to them. It was me being delivered by them. The final, paralyzing question that clawed at my mind was, what did they consider to be a specimen? And what exactly was the gift that was scheduled for delivery at dawn? And would that delivery involve my completion of that final, terrifying dash on the slate?